Hey, Anna. Okay, cool. So, hey, everybody. My name is Brandon, Dr. Brandon Peecook, I guess. I've been here at ISU for just under a year. I'm the curator of paleontology down at the Idaho Museum of Natural History, and I'm also a professor here in biology. And so, paleontology does include things like you maybe have heard of, like digging up dinosaurs, but it has a lot of big questions in macroevolution, and in my case, the evolution of vertebrate animals. That's animals with backbones like us. My personal little niche space in the paleontological world are the Permian and the Triassic periods. And so those go from like 200 and, well, the parts I study anyway, like 260 million years ago to maybe 240 million years ago. And this is this time of immense transition in Earth history. There's a huge mass extinction event. A lot of things like the first big vertebrate herbivores and the first big vertebrate predators on land go extinct. And in the aftermath, you have the evolution of groups that are so important to today. You have the first turtles, the first mammals, the first dinosaurs, all in the wake of this big event. And so as you might imagine, there are a whole lot of questions that we can get after. And it's really cool, I think, and we're going to show you a little bit of that today, how we can use the modern world and animals and plants that are alive today to help us better understand the deep past. And then, of course, big extinction events are really important to today because humans are interfering with the biosphere today in big ways. And you can kind of treat the fossil record almost like experiments that have been run. What happens when you really perturb or mess with big ecosystems on Earth? We do see predictable patterns. And so the more and more humans change the surface of the world, we can use mass extinctions to kind of get after what we might expect. Anyway, I hope you've been enjoying this really cool art from a press release from a couple years ago. So when I talk about big extinctions, people often ask, like, you know, what's the difference between like the dodo? You might have heard of the dodo. That's an extinct animal. That's one species. That and a mass extinction. And so mass extinction is defined as something that's killing off an estimated 75 or more % of species on the planet at any one time. And that's kind of an arbitrary number. But if you look at the animals here on the screen you're seeing, I hope you can tell there's animals that are in the water, there's animals on land, there's herbivores and carnivores, there's things in the ocean stuck to the bottom that don't move, there's things that are motile that can move around, things that can swim, herbivores, carnivores, I think I already said. And a mass extinction, and in this case the one I study, which is the Permian and Triassic mass extinction, all those different kinds of things die all at once. So you have to imagine a global sort of event, a global sort of happenstance that's going to affect biotic systems of all different kinds. And so that graph you're seeing there, time is running along the x-axis on the bottom, so 600 million years ago to today, we're on the far right. And the big crash you see where that arrow is, that's the biggest mass extinction in Earth history. So you guys, when you hear about mass extinctions, maybe think about the asteroid that hits when T-Rex was alive, and that's a very dramatic event. But in terms of like destroying the planet and really messing everything up, that asteroid really only messes things up for like big animals like dinosaurs and other big things. But this event back in the Permian really reset ecosystems of all kinds. And so the ecosystem change back then is due, in fact, to massive volcanic activity. So these pictures you're seeing are pictures of mountains in Siberia that are literally made of miles deep lava that came up to the surface during this extinction event. And that, of course, changes the chemistry of the atmosphere, and you get this big mass extinction. So you can imagine why it's kind of scary that, you know, we as humans are kind of acting like volcanoes today because we're also emitting things. And the thing I think a lot of people don't understand about mass extinctions is that they are not momentary events. The asteroid one is kind of off on its own. Most of the big events in Earth history that have been really bad news take place over thousands and thousands of years. So what's in, you know, almost, it's really almost scary is you can be alive in the middle of a mass extinction event for most of them, and you won't really realize you're in the middle of one. They're only really obvious in hindsight. And so back then, the world looked something like this. I hope you guys all recognize this thing. It's Pangaea, the supercontinent. And so before I came to ISU, and now that I'm here at ISU, I've done work kind of on the bottom of the supercontinent and what will eventually be Gondwana. So both in Antarctica, which I'm not going to talk about today, but believe it or not, there are really good fossils from Antarctica. And then where most of my work actually happens is in Zambia, so sort of in Central Africa today. Back in the Permian and Triassic, Zambia is kind of in the temperate zone in southern Pangaea and totally landlocked, which of course it still is today. And so the pictures you're seeing up there on the top of the screen, the one on the left is a mammal relative. It's one of our relatives. You're going to hear more about in a little bit here. And those are the kinds of animals that are really dominant in the Permian period, so before this mass extinction. And then the animal on the right is a really close cousin of dinosaurs. And we've found their fossils a lot in the aftermath of the extinction, because dinosaurs, of course, end up taking over at least a lot of the big ecospace roles on the surface of the earth after this big mass extinction. And then they dominate for quite a long time. And so I've named some of those. We found a lot of those. We're doing research on those. And we're going to tell you a little bit about that. Also, I just thought I'd throw a little Bengal star there. That's where Pocatello is. Pocatello's beachfront property. California, Oregon, and Washington don't really exist yet back then. So it's kind of an interesting idea. So what I wanted to show you guys is just some little bit of an idea of like how a paleontologist starts to build up a study system and gets to know what they're talking about. Like, how do I just go from picking bones out of the ground to building these bigger stories? And so this is going to have a lot of detail on it that you don't really need to pay attention to. But for the last couple of years, I've been a PI on a National Geographic grant going to Zambia. So you guys are looking at a satellite photo now of this big valley in Zambia. And I hope you can see that there's actually color on there. You can see trees and things, but there's also these lines that are going across the screen like this. And those are the strata of this basin, the rocks that we hope are containing the fossils. And then all those little dots and names there are fossils that we were going and finding. And then when we get them back to the museum or to the lab, we can take the rock off and identify them. And so the last couple of years, we've really been, me and my collaborators, kind of like building up our knowledge of this study system. And we found out something that's pretty important to our understanding, that sort of below that yellow line, we have one fauna, if you could imagine, in this Permian period. And so there's a skull of this animal, doesn't matter what its name is. And then different animals exist above the line. And so this is a little zoomed in, but previous to this work, we had kind of been grouping all the fossils we found in this valley into one probable biotic ecosystem back in the Permian. And we're learning now, and we're sampling more, that in fact, there's probably a couple ecosystems in time with a little bit of turnover. Some species, like this tiny little one right there, they live, you know, all through all the rocks. So it's not some big dramatic turnover event, but we're building up our knowledge of how little changes are happening. And why this is important is as you're going up in the rocks there, you're getting closer and closer to the actual big Permian mass extinction event. And parts of the world that aren't Zambia actually have given us a really good idea of what we should expect is happening to ecosystems as we get closer to that event, how ecosystems kind of start to fall apart. And so if we can find a test case in Zambia, we can test those hypotheses that are really only from one spot in the world. And that kind of gets me to my, well, actually, and so does the next slide, so give me 1 second. The other part of the periods we study there, also in Zambia, is the Triassic period. And so that's after the extinction. The extinction's in the rearview mirror. Now we're just talking about recovery and rebirth. And one thing we've been doing in the last few years in Zambia is finding lots and lots and lots of fossils and then figuring out about how old they are. One of the big problems we have is we don't really know how old the rocks are in Zambia in the Triassic period because there's no volcanic rocks. We need volcanic rocks if we want to get an absolute age and know exactly how many millions of years. So what you're looking at right now is just, you know, a pretty picture of a bunch of different kinds of animals, some crocodile relatives, some mammal relatives, some dinosaur relatives in South America, where they actually do have really good dates. And then this is an important time because this is when dinosaurs first really show up. So dinosaurs pop on right here. They don't show up like right after the extinction. There's a little bit of a delay. And so the rocks we have in Zambia should be right then. So I'm really crossing my fingers that we can find some dinosaurs because you know we'll be able to get some serious good funding if we actually get a dinosaur. But in Zambia, these blue stars are showing animals that in the last couple of years we have really found. And that's really cool because they're unknown from that part of Africa. And so this is helping us build this great picture. That one in the middle there that's kind of white is this really weird plant eater with like kind of a beak face. That's actually not a beak. The bones of its actual face make a beak. It's very bizarre and very gross and very weird. But they're these interesting herbivores. There's me when we first found it, and I'm really excited about it. So that field work is a really critical component of our work. And so what I was just saying to you about using the Zambian record from the Permian and the Triassic and then tying it to other parts of the world, that's where a lot of my research questions come from. So biogeography, going back into the deep past, looking at a supercontinent, and then saying, okay, so what do we really have? What do we know? What places do we have fossils from and how do they compare? And so we can compare, I'll pop all these up at once, you guys can just look. We can ask all kinds of different questions across the surface of Pangaea and talk about what the world was like, what biological systems were like in this time of a supercontinent where you have very little endemic animals and plants. Things can go back and forth. And the patterns we can pull out there are really cool. And I know I'm running out of time, so I thought I was gonna explain them to you. I'm actually not gonna. You can ask me if you want to. I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the work my grad students are doing. So you can imagine we're pulling fossils. We have many, many, many new species. And so there's kind of the work of just describing new species, but then also we want to ask questions and get to these bigger ideas in evolution. And so these animals you're seeing here, that little cutie, and then there's a fossil of him with the little bumps on his nose right up above him. That's a fossil we've got from Zambia, these animals called dicynodonts that are related to mammals. And so my grad student, Brenly Ships, she is studying something about how they're feeding. But how is she gonna do that? Well, one of the only animals today that eats like they probably ate, as in having a beak with no teeth, are turtles. And so turtles have nothing to do with these animals that are mammal relatives, but they might have similar function in how they're eating. And so one thing Brenly is starting, and she's just starting her first semester here, is looking at turtle beaks. So this is a 3D computer image of a turtle beak, where she's actually quantifying how complicated the structure of the bone is and how complicated the structure of the actual keratin, the beak, is. And if she can pull numbers together on all the different types of turtles and all the different turtle diets, we maybe can then put dicynodonts, these fossils that only have the bone, into her data set and get a good idea of how they're eating, how they're different from one another. I'm really hopeful for that. Another really cool question is another of my grad students, Xavier. He is studying how animals move and behave using their limbs, so their locomotion and maybe what surfaces they're living on in the Permian and Triassic. There's one project he's involved in that has me really excited. So you guys might know flight evolved 3 times in animals with backbones, and those are the 3 right there: bats, birds, and pterodactyls. And of course, pterosaurs are gone. But both bats and pterodactyls, we don't really know how they got flying. There's no transition fossils. The first pterodactyls and the first bats already have their wings. And so we don't have a good idea of how they went from not flying to flying. And so the fossil in this picture here is one of the earliest kinds of pterodactyl that's ever been known. And it's being redescribed right now, and Xavier and I are part of this project, and he's using his methods to kind of quantify a lot of the bony processes and ways that animals that live today are locomoting, that are getting around. There's a picture of the pterosaur. It's got really tiny little wings. How these animals that live today, how they're getting around, how they're moving on the landscape. And what's really cool is some of these early relatives of pterosaurs, like that little animal down there, that skeleton that's a drawing, he can look at the bones of those animals, and then animals today, like the one above that has really similar proportions, it's an elephant shrew. It runs around on 4 legs and has really strong hopping abilities, and figure out starts of the mechanism of how maybe animals that are kind of lizardy become more in the trees and then eventually become close to these early pterosaurs. Anyway, that's kind of I don't want to give too much away of his work, but it's really exciting stuff. And in both cases, these grads are using the present diversity to inform the past. I have no idea how my time is. I can't hear Josh's music, but I feel like I have to be getting close. Just interrupt me, Josh. The other thing I wanted to mention is just stuff down at the museum. So any undergrads who are watching or people who want to get involved in the lab, I'm also the curator, so we're doing so much work down there. So the Natural History Museum in Idaho is a federal repository. We're the state museum. And so amongst all the other collections, we have a huge fossil collection. And in my year here so far, we've been really trying to grow it. So we've gone out on expeditions, even during COVID, with maybe just 1 or 2 people, which is kind of a bummer. But we're still going out because Idaho has an incredible fossil record that's really kind of been underlooked at. People usually go to Utah and Wyoming, but Idaho has a whole lot. So here's pictures from this last year. There's a trilobite from down near Bear Lake. Here's some ammonites from actually really close to where we're all sitting right now, if you're in Pocatello anyway. There's a piece of crocodile armor from Utah that's only about 50 million years old, which isn't that old, especially for crocodiles. And then I think this is a fun picture. This picture is from 2 days ago when I was out on American Falls on the reservoir, and that's a fossil horse jaw that we're pulling out. So this time of year with irrigation, the water in the reservoir is really low and the beach is covered. We've pulled out bison, we've pulled out mammoth, and I found a horse 2 days ago. And so we're bringing all those things back to the museum because we have to take care of them. And then other scientists, you can study whatever you want. Please come and use the fossils. If my timer really isn't going off yet.
We're out of time, Brandon.
I'm out?
Yep.
Okay, come to Skulls.